The Cascades Female Factory was purpose-built in 1828 and operated as a convict facility until 1856. It was intended to remove women convicts from the negative influences and temptations of Hobart, and also to protect society from what was seen as their immorality and corrupting influence. The factory was located, however, in an area of damp swampland, and with overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate food and clothes, there was a high rate of disease and mortality among its inmates. The Cascades Female Factory is the only remaining factory with remains that give a sense of what female factories were like. The menacing spectre of Mount Wellington towers over the Cascade site, adding to the foreboding sense for those unfortunate enough to be behind the walls.
And there were originally 12 female factories in Australia. There were 5 in this state to cater to the 26,000 female convicts who came here. We were built though over a period of 40 years. And each yard was essentially built a decade after each other, which compounded the massive overcrowding. The site was essentially only built to house about 750, essentially just care facilities. The children remained at that care facility till it was 12, and then it was released to look for its own work and lodgings, which unfortunately was a disaster. Because these children were often unable to find any work outside, and that meant they would then come back into the prison system.
Truganini, one of the last surviving full-blooded Tasmanian First Nations people, taken from her home in Bruny Island, died here, aged 64. Her remains were ultimately returned to her ancestral home almost a century after her death. All the markings and structures on the ground indicate where the cells and other components of the yard were situated. Of particular interest is the size and layout of the solitary confinement cells. Females guilty of disobedience of orders, neglect of work, profane, obscene or abusive language, insubordination, or other turbulent or disorderly or disrespectful conduct shall be punished by the superintendent with close confinement in a dark or other cell until her case shall be brought under consideration of the principal superintendent. Governor George Arthur purchased the site at Cascades for the female factory in 1827. The factory's first intake of female prisoners was in December 1828. It gradually expanded to hold 700 female convicts and their children, though at its peak it was even more overcrowded than usual, holding 1,200 women and children. Rules and regulations for the management of the factory were published in 1829. When the factory opened in 1828, there was one yard. When the factory ceased operation in 1856, there were 5 yards. Yard 2, washing yard. Yard 3, separate apartments. Yard 4, nursery yard, and Yard 5 were added in the intervening years. While not a convict, Mary Hutchinson's life was far from easy. After accompanying her husband on a failed Christian mission to Tonga, the couple were appointed superintendent and matron of the Female House of Correction in Hobart during 1832. The matron's responsibility for the health and behaviour of the inmates was challenging enough, but for Mary it was made worse by the increase in numbers of transported women in the 1830s to 1840s. Caring for her own children and her husband's persistent ill health and incompetence. Despite these difficulties, Mary did introduce many improvements to the welfare and reformation of convicts in the House of Correction. While the matron's cottage remains relatively intact, that of the sub-matron is only a layout, as it is with the majority of the rest of the facility.